Welcome to Changing the Table, a podcast that uncovers the obstacles that people with migration background encounter when participating in politics in Europe. On this podcast, we're not just looking into how migrants can be empowered to take a seat at the decision-making table, but we're also discussing how we can change the table itself. I'm your host, Seden Anlar, a journalist and once undocumented first-generation non-EU immigrant. And in our very first episode, I set off to unmask the key obstacles migrants face that hinder their ability to have a say in decisions that affect them, and strategies and good practices for overcoming them. To explore all these, I'm joined by Shaghi Ahmed, director of Place, a Paris-based startup that champions migrant-led innovation, and also joined by Olivia Long, managing editor at the Migration Policy Group, an independent Brussels-based think and do tank that sets the agenda on integration, migration, and anti-discrimination. Take a listen. Shaghi, Olivia, thank you both so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you so much for us and for including me today with you here.
Of course. Shaghi, you've been working in this field now for many years, but I feel like not many people wake up one day and decide to work in migration, which sometimes can be a challenging field. There's usually a special drive behind it. What is it for you? What drove you to personally get involved in the projects you're working on?
So working with migrants and newcomers is something that I've started working, I think, for more than around 12 years now. And what really drove me is just a simple concept, which is the injustices that face newcomers and migrants in different parts of the world. Initially, I started working with them in Sudan, which is where I'm basically from. And over there, the situation was different and complicated in many different levels, because we're speaking about a country or a region in general that has faced a lot of crisis, conflicts, and at the same time, newcomers have, with the huge numbers, are based there from different countries, but also internally displaced people, which are a huge number in Sudan. Seeing all the injustices that they're facing was something that made me feel like there is a need to contribute to it in different ways. So I started basically by volunteering for some initiatives and organization that works in addressing these injustices, but also by providing opportunities, either education, either medical access, and many other parts. And throughout these years, I get the chance to learn more and found that I'm really passionate about this subject itself. And after moving to Europe, where I got the chance also to work here, firstly, I felt that the concept may be a bit different when it comes to Europe, but the level of injustices may be a bit not to the same level. But in a way, there is a lot of common factors around it. And I felt that there is a need also to continue within this. This is, I believe, what drove me to be here.
Mm-hmm. And those injustices and barriers to political participation are exactly what this podcast is about. So I want to go a bit deeper into some of these words we're talking about, like participation, and explore what they actually mean, because they've been turned into a bit of buzzwords in the past couple of years, and I want to go beyond that. And I want to do that because these kinds of words might sound abstract and theoretical, but they have real impacts on people's lives. So I'd like to bring them to life through your experience, knowledge, and words. So what does meaningful participation mean to you?
That's a great question. So I normally, in when it comes to the word participation, there is an example that has been shared by a good friend of mine that always echo in my mind whenever I'm thinking about the word participation in Europe, specifically for newcomers and migrants. When it comes to Europe as a context, imagine it like it's in a house. So you get invited to a party, and normally newcomers get the chance to be part of the party in some way. So they are in a level, they're participating by either working in certain jobs and so on. However, newcomers don't have the right to play music or choose the type of music that can be played in this party or in this gathering itself. And I feel like this is what makes it a bit difficult a word, so to define itself, because in both sides, if you look at from the European community and European studies, which I understand that also migration itself is something that they have experienced for a while now, like in Europe itself, as nations and as societies, as communities, but there is still a lot of things that has to be learned. And of course, with the level of changes that the world is facing right now, where people are speaking about democracy, open rights, and so on, made the word of participation itself is something that is quite hard to be, defined ultimately. What do you mean by participating in the society? Is it just mean that getting the chance to interact with the social life? Is it the economical participation by providing equal means, or positive discrimination when it comes to access to, incubations for entrepreneurs, for example? Or is it just the fact that you want to be participate politically by, getting the chance to vote for the municipal elections and so on? So it is a hard way, but what is quite clear is that the efforts that has been played or invested by many institutions within the European level is not matching the real needs of what's happening in the ground. And between the reality of the situation where you feel like newcomers always been classified or filtered in a way that is like, yeah, okay, we're providing the economical means, okay, you get the chance to have the social security, it means that you are an equal participant, or like within the society, is, I feel like it's an outdated definition for it, where we should make sure that newcomers get the chance to feel empowered while living in the society and having the feeling or that sense that they are an active contributor to the society. Maybe last point that I want to mention here, it just came to my mind now while talking about it. I feel like participation is also, from the point of view of the newcomer itself, it's also related to the concept of belonging. So what does it mean for me to participate in something if I don't have that sense of belonging, or if I don't feel, that I'm connected to this ecosystem, or this nation, city, school, neighborhood, call it whatever. And I feel like also trying to define what does it mean for you to participate or to belong to this country or city is something that has to be looked at from the perspective and the point of view of the newcomers.
Mm-hmm. One of the projects you're working on is called Emerging Leaders, and it's addressing all these shortcomings and barriers you're talking about. So, according to my very little research, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but the project aims to create empowered newcomer leaders, new faces in traditional leadership networks, new conversations coming from these new points of view, and new ideas, data, and narratives that reach people at scale. So it sounds exactly like changing the table. So I really want to know and explore this project a little bit to see how it works, but also where it's coming from, what barriers to participation you've identified, which then led to this initiative, and which barriers are you addressing with it?
Sure. So Emerging Leaders is it's an initiative that works on introducing a front line of newcomer leaders who would like to change the status quo in Europe when it comes to the topics that the newcomers themselves are about to deal with. Some people, get the chance to arrive to Europe. I'm based right now, like as an organization, it's based in France, in Paris, and we have a huge amount of newcomers, of course. We have people who've worked, for example, for 20 years with the World Bank in country in Central Asia. And this person, when they have moved to France, they started working in a kebab shop. And now I'm not trying to criticize the fact that kebab shop is not an equivalent or not something that matches. I'm not trying to point on kebab shop is not the perfect thing, but it's in a way it's a lose-lose situation, because you're not gonna be able to leverage or capitalize on the experience of that person that they have managed to groom throughout the last 20 years in their own country. And at the same time, this individual won't be able to reach out or maximize their, capitalize again on their skills that have gathered throughout all these years in a way that can, make useful. For us, it's about how can we make sure that newcomers have an equal / an empowering position in the work that they're doing. And also another thing that we have seen it quite clearly, and in many different parts where we're contributing so far. And it was really interesting to see that that as a newcomer, if you want to be within this sphere, lead something or to be a team leader or something, it has to be with refugees or newcomers. So as a newcomer, you need to work with newcomers. And for us within Emerging Leaders, it's not about that. If you're standing for climate governance, if you stand for youth inclusion, if you are supporting LGBTQ rights, if you are working on medical care for everyone, whatever topic that you're standing for or representing, it is for you to decide what you want to work on, and not to be framed in a certain box, or framed that matches what is being expected from you. Another objective that we're trying to do is basically to change the narrative about newcomers, which I think that is quite clear. It's the major objective of that, because newcomers are, like, as you can feel it, like newcomers came to Europe and they will be going to steal the jobs. But guess what? That's not the reality of things. If we're going to look at the numbers, reports about the importance of newcomers when it comes to how it contributes to the GDP in Europe and many different, specifically in countries in West and East Europe also, and North, and trying to work with them and proving that, hey, that's not the reality of things, and maybe it will be wiser to stop watching or looking from this type of, from a shallow level, I would call it, like, instead of just focusing and understand the impact of newcomers. So far, we had the chance to work in around 18 countries of Europe with more than 50, right now around 60 leaders who have joined the program. We get the chance to train around 300 throughout the last few years, and most of them stand for different topics. Starts from education for all, access for education, goes to gender-based violence and how to make sure to reduce it within the marginalized communities around Europe, and many different topics that we're trying to introduce to the table from a perspective of newcomers.
Mm-hmm. Olivia, I want to turn to you. I mean, Shaggy gave us incredible insights, and there's a lot to unpack there. You at the Migration Policy Group recently conducted this big research and report, Meaningful Civic and Political Participation of New Europeans, Obstacles and Recommendations. For this research, you interviewed many people with migration background. So can you tell us a bit about the research first so we understand the scope, and then also maybe do a bit of mapping out for us in terms of what barriers to participation you identified in the report, and maybe any overlaps that you see with what Shaggy said or any differences you noticed?
Yeah, sure. So, as the title suggests, the report illustrates the main obstacles to the civic and political participation of new Europeans. So, we identified several people who are quite prominent in migrant communities, or people who are quite active in advocacy that relates to new Europeans across Europe. And we conducted interviews with them. We asked them quite extensively about the challenges and obstacles they've experienced so far. And we also asked them to identify strategies and good practices they've seen in closing this gap, or at least working to close this gap. And then, as a result of that, we've created a list of policy recommendations for policy and decision makers that we hope go some way towards closing that gap. In terms of overlap with what Shoghi said, there was quite a lot of overlap. The very first question we asked participants was to outline what meaningful participation is to them. And as Shoghi touched upon, encouraging the participation of new Europeans involves not only just considering their perspectives, but also actively seeking to understand their perspectives. And that, I think, leads to a certain level of equal participation and exchange. One of the interview participants said that the thing they aim for is nothing about us without us. And I really like that. We've seen it quite a lot in this research. You can apply that to pretty much everything, as well as a feeling that their participation is valued and listened to and acted upon. And then in terms of challenges and obstacles, again, there was quite a lot of crossover with what Shoghi said. The obstacles that we highlight in the report are those that were mentioned multiple times by multiple people that we interviewed, which I think is obviously distressing because there are so many obstacles and so many people are experiencing them. But in terms of progress, it's quite helpful because it means that it really does highlight that there are these shared experiences, and it really helps to identify specific action points that the communities can work on. So one of the big ones was funding, not just a lack of it, but also a lack of accessible funding streams and information about funding, how to access it, how to apply for it. It's often not available in useful languages. It's often only available in the language of host communities. And although migrant-led organizations often have everything in place to do something very good with that funding, if they don't apply in this very particular way, they find that they're never granted that funding. So that was one of the biggest ones. But an issue that I think Shoghi briefly alluded to is this issue of tokenism, a major obstacle being that people of migrant background, or at least those that we interviewed, often feel that they are They're invited to these round tables, they're consulted, they're asked to advocate for their whole communities, and then their engagement stops there. They go to the meeting, they give their opinion, they give feedback, they give constructive criticism, whatever it is, they work really hard at it. The meeting ends and they don't receive any further communication from decision makers after that point. So they don't know if their input was even taken on board. And that really makes them feel as if they're not valued as equal partners, that their input isn't really listened to. A lot of people also mentioned, both at the public level and at the policy making level, this idea that New Europeans and people with migrant background don't have a lot to say because they come from a different place and therefore it's not relevant. Their experiences are not relevant. Or, which was also mentioned by several people, their experiences are seen as relevant, but only within the confines of this very specific migrant-related policy, for example, or a policy suggesting that only relates to refugees. And that's not enough.
Yeah, it's almost like these people have moved. So from now on, they can only talk about moving.
Yeah.
Everything else, every other aspect of their life or the knowledge they acquired their whole lives disappear.
Yeah, exactly. And that also touches on something that Shoghi said about having a choice. As many people said, for participation to be meaningful, they need to be able to A, choose that they want to participate, and B, choose what they want to participate in, what kind of policies they want to be talking about. As Shoghi said, people have many, many interests in topics that don't only relate to migrants or migration. So many different cross-cutting social issues, political issues that people have a lot to say on, perhaps by virtue of their migration-related experiences, but also just by virtue of their past experiences, their entire lives in other countries.
Absolutely. I love the saying, nothing about us without us. I love that. That just really sums it up and also shows it's just that simple.
Yeah.
Like it's so common sense. It's so simple. But then we do write pages and pages and pages of documents and meetings and everything just to get there. And I don't know why it's so hard sometimes to accomplish that and go beyond, the checking the boxes and tokenism and all of the things you mentioned.
Yeah, I even writing this report, I kind of hit a hurdle very early on because I felt like what we were saying was so obvious and we were repeating ourselves so many times that I was missing something, like there must be something more that we had to say. But actually I think it's just that simple. It's just that message, although it's repeated time and time again, is still lost.
Exactly. And that's how you lose trust in the processes and institutions, right? And it does sound like there very much overlaps between what you identified and what Shoghi identified, which goes to show there's a wide range of barriers to political participation, but we can also say most of them are experienced by many at a large scale. So you really see the trends there that need to be addressed. Shoghi, turning back to you, identifying the barriers is really the beginning of the process. We then need to come up with the ways to eliminate them. And one of the things we would like to do with this podcast is to showcase these solutions, not only to share and archive best practices and learn from each other, but also to create a space where we acknowledge them, acknowledge the successes and achievements, and also celebrate them openly. So, how are you changing the table?
I would call it definitely to creating a platform. I mean, being happily and gratefully and honorably, like for us, it's an honor just to be the platform for people to get a chance to know each other and to know their own value, and the fact that getting the chance to work on something that you like is not something that is easy, but getting a chance to reflect with people who are like-minded, who are passionate about these topics is something that I'm really honored that we are aiming to provide, but also within this space trying to bring again the narratives and share these narratives with the other groups or other institutions. So like either with municipalities, so bringing that these voices exist. So that this is what we're trying to do. So trying to bring everyone together and hear from each other.
You've been in this field for a long time. What would you recommend to your peers or maybe more importantly to policymakers on how to change the table?
I would go first of all with the peers. I feel like putting it in two brackets, like even if it starts as a simple idea in your head, don't put it aside, don't forget about it. And as emerging leaders, in the way how we co-founded, me and another wonderful individual, Charlotte Hushman, it was literally a discussion that we've had while running to the metro. Like literally, we didn't get the chance to work on the things together because we didn't have the time. So we know that at the end of the day, it's the only way is just that we walk to the metro together. And that was the only moment for us to literally brainstorm and put the design for the things. And basically in 2019 until now, the level of impact that I've mentioned that we're proud of, but at the same time that we're looking to do more in the next few months and years is something that we're entitled for. So don't underestimate these tiny things. That's one. The second one is try to link everything and make sure that it's community driven. So issue that you're trying to address, how the project that you're proposing is supporting the communities that you're trying to focus on. Thirdly, for the peers, don't overwhelm yourself. If we managed to learn something throughout the last 3 years, I would say with the COVID and the post-COVID world that we're living in right now, is that you have to love yourself in order for you to give others. So try and make sure to specify, and make sure that you're grounded as an individual in order for you to give others, and get the love to yourself. So in order for you to give love to others. For policymakers, I would say we understand that bureaucracy is something that policymakers in whatever institution is something that it makes things a bit complicated. But with all that, I really feel that they need to start understanding that newcomers are an asset. So the way how you said it, with these false narratives that exist right now in many different parts of Europe, we definitely need to make sure that they basically understand that the presence of the newcomers needs to be in the table. And trust newcomers and collaborate with them. And it's not just because for the sake of that they need you, but because you need them also.
Yes, I love that. You need them too. Exactly. Olivia, what about the recommendations that came from the New Europeans that you interviewed for the report?
So again, there's crossover here with what Shoghi said. One of the big ones is this need to recognize the strength that people with migrant background have and what they have to contribute to these policy decision-making processes. So one recommendation that comes from that is awareness raising among decision makers themselves, but it also means awareness raising among migrant communities. I think because of these prevailing negative narratives that we've already mentioned, many people often don't realize that they even can contribute, or that what they have to contribute is meaningful or worth listening to in the first place. So that's recognizing strengths, I think, on both sides. And related to that is also dismantling harmful narratives. I think we've talked about that one. Really, really a lot of work needs to be done in the public sphere, and I think directly with policymakers themselves, which is something that many of the research participants said. We need an approach that's not just top-down, where we're sort of inviting people with a migrant background into the space. We need people with a migrant background to be directly speaking with policymakers and saying, this is how you need to do it. And something Shoghi also mentioned, I think, was capacity building. And I think that's something that the Emerging Leaders Programme does very well, building the skills and the advocacy capacity of both individuals and organizations to contribute to decision-making processes. And that also relates to funding. So another recommendation is first release enough funding to support those kinds of developments, that kind of capacity building, and then also support people in learning how to access it and navigating these very, very complicated processes that require a lot of intricate knowledge of the way host societies work.
And when it comes to dismantling harmful narratives, I, as a journalist, think media has a big role to play too, which is why we're doing this podcast. We need more content out there that talks about migration, migrants, and political participation, civic participation this way. So you've listed so many great recommendations and solutions. So they're clearly there. They've been identified. Now the question is, how can we achieve them and change the table?
Yes, and I have seen, although of course there is also a trend in anti-migrant sentiment across Europe, I have also seen a trend in individual journalists focusing on the promotion of migrant integration, not only highlighting the excellent achievements of specific migrants, but just in general highlighting the importance of social inclusion. And I think as that takes hold and hopefully starts to influence other more positive public narratives, that will trickle up and start affecting policy and decision-making processes as well. That's the hope.
That is the hope. That is the hope. I want to talk a bit more about these harmful narratives because they have grave impacts. These harmful narratives sometimes also victimize migrants and perpetuate the disempowerment of people with migration background, which is a huge barrier to participation. And on top of that, when you look at the current discourse on migration, moving is also portrayed as either a sad or negative act and experience. But of course, it's much more nuanced than that. There are so many more emotions involved. There are so many more dynamics involved. So at the end of every episode, I'm asking our guests to share with us a joyful moment they've experienced in their work in this area and what strength have they witnessed. This, of course, can be a personal story, or it doesn't have to be maybe something you saw or something that was shared with you, something that you saw as a part of your work and had an impact on you. What would you say?
Wow, that's also an interesting question again. I would go with something that was quite recent, like a couple of weeks ago. End of August, beginning of September, we went all together with these individuals to for the third time in the last 2 years, and this new group that have joined us in this summer. Getting the chance to know them online was enough by itself, but it was so joyful to get a chance to meet them and hear from them. And the most empowering moment was when they were trying to communicate within themselves, but also trying to build things together in the long term. And hearing the fact that if we're talking about Greece and the situation in Greece, and then going to the reality of things in Italy, for example, or in Denmark, a lot of things are different. I'm not saying it's the same, but brainstorming and getting a chance, to creating, for example, these wonderful ideas and trying, of course, to keep up with them, to be honest with you, was a learning experience for me personally, but also for us as an organization. Another thing is the co-responsibility. So even if it's not your organization that you're leading, because the people from the accelerator are basically profiles like general executive directors, CEOs of their own organizations, so people who are leading organizations that have huge impact in the communities and so on. And what was really interesting to hear that, for example, some individuals who had some issues when it comes to something around operations and finance in their organization, and there's this wonderful, also another person who felt like, I'm gonna flew to you after this end of retreat just to work with you for a couple of days. So this camaraderie, and because of this individual contribution, the other person get the chance to get a grant. These type of examples just give you some sort of an idea that, active collaboration within newcomers is something that is quite needed, and providing platform for people to get the chance not just to lead sessions and deliver, but also to get the chance to bond as one.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. And I think camaraderie is a great way to put it. And I think this is a powerful note to end on. Thank you so much, Shaggy, for coming onto the podcast and sharing your expertise, knowledge, and experience with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Seden, and thank you, MPG, for providing also this space.
Thank you. That was my interview with Shaggy Ahmed and Olivia Long. In this episode, we heard it loud and clear. Nothing about us without us. It is that simple. And sometimes, all it takes to move mountains is a conversation held by two running to the metro station. Right here on this podcast, I will continue to talk to community leaders, researchers, and policymakers about how we could remove barriers and make European democracy inclusive and fit for an increasingly diverse and internationally mobile society. This podcast is produced by the New Europeans Initiative, a project by the Migration Policy Group. Funding for the podcast is provided by the Citizens, Equality, Rights and Values Program of the European Union. If you like this episode, please subscribe and spread the word. Changing the Table is available on all podcast platforms. If you want to stay updated, follow the Migration Policy Group on social media at MigPolGroup and subscribe to the newsletter at www.migpolgroup.com. Thank you, and see you very soon.